Sounds great. So we're going to stick with this theme of non-traditional threats, including in the information space, for our next session. We will have the privilege of hearing from people like TV producers and film writers and journalists and authors who work on this issue of uncovering truth in today's complex security environment. They will talk about how they use new media to help shine a light on the facts around us, to expose atrocities in conflict zones, to help counter propaganda and disinformation campaigns, and really to speak truth to power. Now I will hand it over to someone who knows these issues better than most, Edward Lucas, who is a senior fellow at CEPA and also was a longtime senior editor at The Economist. Again, if everyone just would like to send in some questions via the app, we'll open up the Q&A session right now. And with that, Edward, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for taking part. Greetings from London, which is where I am, and what a fascinating presentation that was from DFR Lab. I can't wait to get going on those geolocation tools. And we have a blitzkrieg session here for just half an hour on the extremely interesting questions of information warfare and what we've learned so far. And I'm delighted to be joined by the three panelists, who I'm sure will be familiar to many of you, if not all of you. Jessikka Aro, who was the Finnish journalist who exposed the troll factory and received a full onslaught of Russian attacks as a result. Andrea Chalupa, who is a journalist and author. Peter Pomerantsev, who wrote Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And I, of course, am a senior fellow here at CEPA. So I'm going to get straight onto the discussion, and I'm going to start off by asking all three of our panelists for a very quick 2-minute take on what have we learned since February the 24th. February the 24th was clearly a geopolitical game changer, huge wake-up call for the many Europeans who weren't paying attention, a vindication for the many other Europeans who've been warning for ages about Russia. But in terms of the subjects that we're discussing here, about information warfare and the role it plays in influence operations, what have we learned? What's the biggest takeaway since February the 24th? Peter, I'm going to start with you.
I'm sorry, I lost you for a second. What was the question about the 24th?
What have we learned since the 24th? What's the take? What if we look back on the last 8-9 weeks of war, in the field that we're working in, what's the big takeaway? What have we learned?
I mean, I suppose I'm still far too close to it to really say what we've learned. We've learned that we have absolutely no institutional capacity to engage the Russian people. We've learned that this huge challenge, which is really where the war in many ways will be ultimately won with a change of political course in Russia. We have really very few institutions, no research, virtually no kind of like capabilities to start that discussion. We completely abandoned any attempts at creating any kind of democratic communications infrastructure after the end of the Cold War. And all we've had is one video from Arnie, which was incredibly successful. Arnold Schwarzenegger did a video reaching out to the Russian people, 15 million views in Russia, and that's it. That's been our attempt so far, and that's shameful.
Well, thank you for that gloomy take. It seems to me there is a slightly more positive take, which is that much of the Russian myth-making and operations in Western societies has fallen down absolutely flat when confronted with the reality of the Russian invasion. But let me go to you next, Jessikka. You're perhaps the leading exponent of this in Finland, which is a country where public opinion has changed very sharply since the start of the war, to the point you're now on the verge of joining NATO, which I'm sure many of us will be delighted about. But what's your take? What surprised you most since February the 24th, and what would you like to tell us about it?
Thank you so much. It's an excellent question. As someone who has been investigating the Russian trolls and their messages and narratives ever since 2014, it's really disgusting and shocking to see how the hate speech and anti-Ukrainian messages, the messages such as Ukrainians are Nazis and Ukrainian regime are fascists, which is what the trolls have been spreading and the fake news have been spreading in the international information space coming from the Kremlin across the West and especially inside Ukraine and especially inside Russia, to see it play out, to see it being practiced in concrete world, to see how Russian soldiers really seem to believe that and really seem to not give any human rights to Ukrainian civilians who they are ruthlessly and brutally attacking and violating and committing war crimes. So this is one of the key takes that why information warfare is so dangerous. It is being used to agitate people into hateful actions. In this case, a genocide in the heart of Europe is being fueled by at least a decade of hate speech being spread by the Kremlin amongst Russians and people who are now waging kinetic warfare against Ukrainians in Ukraine. So it's one of these old lessons of why disinformation, information warfare, and hate speech are so dangerous.
Thank you so much for that, Jessikka. And you're absolutely right that we've had 25 years of venomous attacks on the Baltic states, on people who've dared to stand up against the Kremlin, and we've systematically underestimated their effect and ignored the pattern behind them. And now we are paying the consequence. And of course, Ukraine is paying it in blood. We just play it in discomfort and disruption. So, Andrea, with your interest in Mr. Jones, the British Welsh journalist who exposed the famine, there's a kind of deja vu about this, and yet again atrocities are happening in Ukraine. But whereas with the Holodomor, it was very, very hard to get the message across, we now see really intense international interest in the war crimes, the rapes, the destruction of artworks, and so on. What's your takeaway from this? Have we learned anything since the 30s?
No, because it's the history of the Holodomor is, of course, repeating. You have bans on the Ukrainian language in areas that Russia's occupying right now in Ukraine. You have a hunting down of the social fabric of the country, the political elite, the mayors, the journalists, and just like you did during the time of the 1930s, it's all Stalinist, the brutality that Putin is carrying out today in Ukraine and has for some time in areas that he's occupied. And so it's sort of like, why weren't more people on our level and as alarmed as we were when Putin was bringing back the cult of Stalin and putting up all these statues to Stalin and changing textbooks and so on. In all the years when I was researching the history of the Holodomor through the story of Gareth Jones, a young independent Welsh journalist, very idealistic, who risked his life and career to go into Ukraine, report on the famine, and keep reporting on it, even when the powers that be were trying to discredit him. And during all those years of research into Gareth Jones's story, I became very interested in issues of internet neutrality, internet freedom, because I really believe that if Gareth had Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, he could go directly to the people with his message, with his videos, with all sorts of things that could create the sort of social media narratives that we're seeing today that are driving support for Ukraine, that are driving a sea change across countries like Germany. And that's all thanks to the social media army of supporters that Ukraine has around the world. But unfortunately, now that I'm seeing this play out, social media can not stop a genocide, as we're seeing, but it can rally support that Ukraine, of course, did not have in the 1930s.
Yes, it's very tantalizing to think what an effect Gareth Jones would have had if he'd been able to use Twitter and I think the kind of the citizen army of Ukrainians armed with smartphones who are documenting war crimes. And we're seeing this particularly with the investigation into Bucha, that there's an incredible amount of evidence which is just lacking for the Holodomor. I think I'm right in saying there are no moving pictures at all of the Holodomor and only a handful of black and white images. So we are in a different age. So I feel that the point of this really is that we have the means available. We haven't yet taken advantage of the means. We're not actually creating a climate of fear among Russian human rights abusers. They think I'd better not do this. And we've yet really, I think, to mobilize world opinion on our side. It's very impressive the way that Western opinion has shifted. But if you look, as I do, at the South African press or the Indian press, it's seen there very much as a sort of two sides, or even sympathy to Russia. So let me get back to you, Peter. I know this is something you're working on very hard at the moment. One of our priorities has got to be to puncture the Kremlin's information Iron Curtain and get into Russia. And you've said very eloquently, we've disarmed our institutional capability that we had during the Cold War, with everything from samizdat to shortwave radio and many things in between. In a couple of minutes, if you were able to address the leaders of the free world now and say, and they were tasking you with getting into the Russian information space, what would be your recommendations?
Firstly, we need an analytical capability, which we really don't have. We're relying on very, very dodgy and highly specious bits of polling. So the first thing is to really understand the analytical capacity, to really understand audiences, listen to them. And that means using everything from, various types of economic data, various types of just talking to people in various fora, qualitative research, and so on and so forth. So that needs to be compiled and focused. Again, that's not doing something creepy like forget about this Cambridge Analytica propaganda nonsense. It's the absolute opposite of that. That's what the Russians do. We need to do the opposite, which is talk to people, listen to them, understand their anxieties, understand why they're vulnerable to propaganda, or whether they are, because I see a lot of sociological research which points to a lot of skepticism among Russians towards their own propaganda. So we start with that. And then we have to think of a way of reaching out to them, which is sort of the diametric opposite to what the Russians do to us. So they have an information war doctrine, which is based around disinformation, confusion, undermining. We need a democratic communication doctrine, which is about engaging people as citizens, informing them, listening to them, and inspiring them to be democratic citizens. We have to do the opposite of what they're doing. We actually live in a post-ideological age. I think the main ideologies that we have today are in communications theories. Both the Russians and the Chinese fundamentally think that people are sheep, and that they can be manipulated and disinformed and manipulated, while we need a communications theory which ultimately looks at people as citizens that can be engaged. So I think on every level, there's a sort of theoretical piece, there's an analytical piece, and then there's the actual action piece. And I know we have the BBC, wonderful, Ready for Europe, wonderful, but forever destined to be trapped in a liberal bubble by definition of who they are. We need to be supporting new media initiatives that talk to people in their own language, that talk to soldiers in the language that they understand, that talk to Burats and Tatars in the language and the agendas that they understand, that matter to them. Which is what you do if you're creating any media. You wouldn't just scream down at them saying, this is the truth, which is kind of what we do. You'd say, guys, what's up? What are your concerns? What are your thoughts about your mortgages and your children's futures and conscription and corruption in the army? And what do you think about the fact that sanctions for the elite mean one thing and something very different for you, and so on and so forth. So yeah. It's just good old democratic communication, but it needs investment and it needs strategic planning.
Yes, it's a big question. Who's the we here? Is this something that's best done by national governments, or is it something that we should be looking for? The G7 has its counter-disinformation unit. We're obviously hosted in part here today by NATO. Maybe NATO's got a role here. I'm always whenever I hear the word we, I always say we who. But Andrea, I want to ask you on a slightly different thing, which is that to me, the absolutely standout media earthquake since the start of the war has been President Zelensky. Now, like many people, I've been gnashing my teeth in previous years at Ukraine's inability to tell its story well. I have fantastic NGO efforts, and we saw tremendous operations right at the time of Maidan, and before that, the Orange Revolution. But if anyone had said to me that Ukraine's elected political leadership would be absolutely dominating the international discourse about an issue involving Ukraine, I'd have said maybe in some parallel universe, but not here. But President Zelensky has absolutely aced this. And I wonder if you'd just like to reflect a little bit on that and where you see this going forward. Are we just going to continue to see, he's given video addresses to practically every legislator in the world, and there's these wonderful nightly or early morning video addresses to Ukrainian people. Is that just going to continue? What do you think of the Ukrainian effort?
Well, Zelensky, of course, represents this younger generation that's coming up. His wife, of course, is part of that. She wears sneakers with dresses. She has a wonderful, strong career of her own. So they're this modern Ukrainian couple. And so it's the younger generation that's coming up. Maybe they're born in the Soviet Union, but then they really came of age and built their careers through this internet age. And the freedom of expression and the freedom of thought really reflects that. And this creative, wonderful energy of this new Ukraine. So that will certainly continue. The big question is Ukraine doesn't really have a pattern of re-electing its presidents. So we'll see, given the unity around Zelensky right now, whether he will break that. But what's for certain is that this young, youthful, creative, innovative energy is going to continue, whether it's Zelensky or someone else. Ukrainians have this wonderful, culturally strong characteristic of self-reliance and resilience and the spirit of independence, which has gone through generations of its artists, from Taras Shevchenko to Les Ukrainka and others. So it's very much part of their national identity going back many centuries. And I just want to comment on the earlier point where you said, who is this we? Who is going to be the we that sort of breaks through to the Russians? In a conversation I had with a Russian organizer, she was saying, invest in us, invest in the Russians that were forced abroad. We're the ones that are keeping the flame of democracy for Russia alive. As anyone who's been following Ukraine's story closely knows, Kyiv and other cities across Ukraine have been hotbeds for resistance movements of dissidents from Belarus and Russia. Those people are still there. They've had to, of course, leave Ukraine, but so it's in the dissidents that we need to invest in. They're asking us to invest in them. They want immigration support. They want financial support for their programs for independent media. They want cultural support so they can tell their own history. And because one thing we're going to be stuck with is this genocidal imperialist mindset that has been glorified in Russia for far too long. Dictators depend on some sort of report. You can say whatever you want about the Poles in Russia, but Putin does have genuine support from a sizable amount of the Russian population. And we have to support the dissident Russians to try to dismantle that, try to confront that. And one important way to do that is to help Russians tell their own history. When I was in Warsaw working on Mr. Jones, I met with a group of Russians living in exile, and they asked me a shockingly basic question. They said, how do we as Russians talk about our history? We don't know where to start, because they've been so traumatized and gaslit under all these years of Putin. So we have to support them there, because uncovering, exhuming that history, helping organizations like Memorial come back wherever they are internationally, really adding a lot of resources to those groups will go a tremendous way in planting powerful seeds of hope for a democratic Russia.
I absolutely agree about the seeds of hope. I noticed here in London, where we have a large number of Russians have turned up, that there's a lot of people who are here because they don't like Putin and they don't like the disruption to their lifestyle that's caused by the war. Their attitudes to Ukraine are not always as impeccably liberal as their attitudes to Russian domestic politics. And I think there's plenty of room for targeted information into that space, because there's a sort of liberal imperialist Russians who would be quite happy for Russia to win the war, because they would like to get back to the life that they were enjoying in Russia beforehand. And there's something we need to look at on that. But I was very struck by what you said about self-reliance and this kind of Ukrainian grit. And it reminds me of this wonderful, untranslatable Finnish word, sisu, which I'm going to ask Jessikka to elaborate on a bit, because I think one of the things about information warfare is it's not just the information which flows from a perpetrator to a victim, it's the mindset of the people among whom it lands. And there's something about Finland which seems to mean that where disinformation just bounces off. And so Jessikka, just talk us through a little bit about Finnish resilience to disinformation. And do you think any of you have everything from strong public media through to kids in schools being taught disinformation, to spot disinformation almost before they learn to read? What elements of that do you think that Finland could bring to NATO, for example, if you join NATO? What elements are exportable?
Oh, definitely. I love that idea of Sisu. It's really something, combination of adamance and perseverance and the willingness to go through a gray stone, as they say, no matter what, and keep your head calm and cool. But yes, definitely, Finland unfortunately has the experience of being under Soviet aggression and having to fight itself through it, and having its all of the teenagers fighting for it as volunteers, as well as women fighting for it as volunteers. So we have this kind of like a whole of society approach to defense, which guides us still. And many layers of society are in one way or another really well trained to counter as well as recognize these operations. One really interesting example, for example, from recent years, from the information warfare years, the Kremlin tried to plant the Sputnik, member of the RT family, really aggressive arm in Finnish language back in 2014. And they started recruiting journalists, and then they started put out fake material. But it just didn't last long. You know why? Because no one read it, because everyone knew it's Russian propaganda. So of course they then found other ways of attacking us in the information space, but that's another story. But yes, this is what we do well. We volunteer, we help each other, we rally around people who become targeted, who become victims of, for example, Russian trolls. There's super active social media community in Finland, and this is also something that I would love to see being used internationally too, because that really helps. When someone first spots a troll, then they always also ask the others to, for example, report it to Twitter or Facebook, and then there are a lot of people going after these trolls, and there is an ongoing support to all kinds of anti-troll activities.
Thanks so much for mentioning Twitter, because that takes us on to what the topic I wanted to spend our last few minutes on, and golly, the time's gone quickly. Twitter is, I think, obviously far smaller than Facebook, but it's something that everyone in journalism and politics and international security regards almost as their default social media platform. And so it's of enormous importance what approach Twitter takes on two key issues. One is verification and the other is on content moderation. And I'm sure all of us have had the experience of seeing either ourselves or people we know impersonated on Twitter, and the rather frustrating business of trying to get Twitter to take down accounts which are just fake accounts. And we've also seen Russian trolls running rampant over Twitter, and rather unsuccessful efforts in many cases to get them exposed. And we also see Russian embassy accounts sometimes not labelled as Russian official accounts, or sometimes with a blue tick, sometimes without. So it's quite a mess, to put it politely, at Twitter. And now we have Elon Musk taking over. So I want you to imagine, dear panelists, for the final few minutes of this session, that we have Elon Musk on this Zoom call, and you are briefing him about how to fix Twitter, what his agenda should be. So clear things that he should do, or maybe things that he should not do. And I'll go to you first, Peter. Advice to Elon Musk, please.
I don't think anything's going to happen. I think Twitter is what it is. I think, sure, the content moderation should be more transparent, should have more checks and balances and be more democratic. But Twitter is what it is. I'm not scared of Elon Musk. I think he's just a showman, and I think we're all just obsessing over nonsense. I'm sorry.
And I think that there's a very strong argument for having making the blue tick verification really something crunchy, that you can, maybe with a zero knowledge proof, you show that you've got a passport, you don't have to give your passport details, you show you've got a phone number. And I think it would already make things better if everybody who was real could get a blue tick, and that would put the trolls into a second category. I also think it's quite important to know what the rules are for being chucked off Twitter, and seeing whether and having some sort of appeal. Anne-Marie Brady, our great friend from New Zealand, was plucked off Twitter briefly for saying completely true things about the Chinese Communist Party, and that seemed to me to be a bit of an abuse. But Andrea, what about you? What would you advice would you give Elon Musk?
I would advise Elon Musk not to purchase Twitter and instead solve world hunger with all the money that he has. I think that would be a lot more productive and pleasurable for him. I think and taking over Twitter and the content moderation is going to be a huge headache, especially with regulations coming out of Europe. He's going to lose interest, I think, after some time. But my advice to him would be to keep the label on anybody who works for a dictatorship. I think when Putin's total war invasion of Ukraine first started, and suddenly you had these Westerners who work for RT and other, or have shows with RT like George Galloway and others, suddenly got a mark, a scarlet letter on their Twitter account that said this account is affiliated with Russian state media. I think, and that was a wonderful day for a lot of us who've spent a long time on Twitter being harassed by people like that. And I think that's important to have that there to really show who they are, where their values lie, beyond any doubt, because what those agents, those Kremlin agents, disinformation agents, propaganda agents, whatever you want to call them, what those Western pundits do is they muddle the truth, and they have no problem attacking others and trying to discredit others, even though they themselves are taking blood money working for Putin's propaganda machine. So I think keeping those labels on and is a good thing, and it should be limited to anybody who's taking money from a dictatorship.
Yes, well, I'm certainly in favour of that, and I should say, by the way, that everyone who's watching this should follow our panelists on Twitter and engage with them. But Jessikka, you have, I think, 48,000 Twitter followers, and you have used Twitter extremely effectively to get your message across, but you've also been the subject of some pretty appalling attacks on social media as well. So what would your advice be to Mr. Musk, apart from obviously visit Finland, which would be a very good thing for him to do?
Oh yeah, I would seriously want him to take into account these smaller language areas in which these Russian trolls are also active. And despite the fact that maybe Twitter employees don't understand Finnish language or Finnish language Russian trolling or other small language areas Russian trolling, they should still listen to these user reports and actually start obeying their own community standards. At the moment, they are unfortunately not so. For example, Twitter bans already now supposedly crimes as well as fake profiles on its platform. Well, when there are then Russian trolls and Russian propagandists using that platform to attack other people, just like Adrian said, to harass and to conduct crimes such as stalking or libel or aggravated libel or things like that, then Twitter is nowhere to be seen fulfilling those community standards. So I would start from there. And obviously it would be of great interest of academic, journalistic, societal interest to receive information of new accounts that the Russian troll factories are establishing there. So Twitter has in the past published big lists of these Russian trolls, but I want to see them published in the future too. So we have so little information about them, but it would be super helpful for national securities of many countries, as well as for human rights to receive information about these Russian trolls. And I love the idea that Adrian already gave about these labels. And it's also a big question whether these Russian embassies that on Twitter act like Russian troll factories, should they be kicked out already?
Well, thank you so much for that, Jessikka. And I think this point about minority or small languages is super important, that there's something about the English-speaking world which is essentially very imperialistic and hegemonic. And if it isn't in English, it basically doesn't matter. And that gets worse the closer you get to Silicon Valley. And I think that the way in which social media platforms can be used, not just for disinformation, but actually for outright genocide, and it's happening in some language that nobody in Silicon Valley speaks, proceeds with impunity. is absolutely shocking, and future generations are going to look back on us and say, how on earth did we let that happen? So it remains only for me to thank our three distinguished panelists, my dear friends, Jessikka, so looking forward to seeing you atom to atom rather than electron to electron. Same goes for Peter and Andrea. Thanks so much for your insights. This world of Zoom calls is gradually coming to an end, not before time. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to another friend, Lauren. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Edward. What a terrific discussion. So wonderful to hear from those voices. Okay, so we are going to take a short break now to give everyone a chance to refill their coffee, whether you're here in person or online. But don't worry, we're not going to leave you bored. There will be some messages coming around on our screens. You'll hear from both senior voices, like former Defense and Foreign Minister Ine Eriksen Soreida, as well as our own General Ben Hodges from CEPA. On social media, check out two young military voices, John Jacobs and Alex Landry, who will talk about their experience with NATO and how NATO's making a difference in the world. So, wishing everyone a good break. We'll see you back here at 3:25 Central European Time and 9:25 Eastern. Stick with us and see you soon.